It is almost impossible to imagine NCIS without Mark Harmon. For 19 seasons, Harmon's Leroy Jethro Gibbs became the calm center of the franchise, a former Marine gunnery sergeant with a sharp instinct for danger, a complicated past, a dry sense of humor, and a habit of communicating more with a stare than a speech. To millions of viewers, Gibbs and Harmon became almost inseparable. But there was a remarkable moment before NCIS became a television institution, when the person who created Gibbs did not think Mark Harmon was right for the role. In fact, when Donald P. Bellisario first heard Harmon's name, his reaction was essentially the opposite of what fans might expect. He saw Harmon as too handsome, too youthful-looking, and not sufficiently rough around the edges for the character he had created. Bellisario had a very specific idea of Gibbs in his head. He wanted someone who could project authority without constantly announcing it. Gibbs needed to feel like a hardened Marine, someone who had experienced war, loss, and betrayal, and had learned to keep most of his emotions buried beneath an almost impenetrable exterior. The younger Mark Harmon Bellisario remembered simply did not match that picture. And yet, one television performance changed everything. That twist in the casting process would ultimately create one of television's most recognizable characters. Before Harmon ever wore Gibbs's famous Marine-style haircut, Bellisario had already formed a strong mental image of the character. NCIS grew out of Bellisario's successful JAG franchise. The new series was intended to follow investigators working for the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, combining military drama with crime-solving and an ensemble dynamic. At the center was Gibbs. He wasn't supposed to be merely another television detective. Gibbs needed to be a leader who could walk into a room and immediately change its atmosphere. He needed military credibility, emotional restraint, and a sense of danger. That made casting particularly important. According to reporting from the Washington Post, Bellisario initially had no particular actor in mind. When somebody suggested Mark Harmon, however, Bellisario's immediate reaction was that Harmon was too much of a pretty boy for the character. That reaction makes much more sense when viewed through the lens of Harmon's earlier career. For years, Harmon had been known as a handsome leading man. He had played doctors, romantic leads, law enforcement figures, and other characters who often relied on his clean-cut screen presence. Bellisario wasn't necessarily questioning Harmon's ability. He was questioning whether the actor could disappear into Gibbs, and that distinction mattered. The creator wasn't searching for the most famous actor. He was searching for Gibbs. Casting is often influenced by something actors cannot control: the audience's memory. An actor can change dramatically over the course of a career, but casting executives may still remember the person they saw years earlier. That was apparently part of Bellisario's problem with Harmon. In Bellisario's mind, Mark Harmon was still the younger, extremely handsome actor he remembered seeing earlier in his career. The Gibbs character required something different. He needed weathering. He needed gravitas. He needed the suggestion that this man had lived through things he would never discuss. Bellisario later explained that his perception of Harmon changed after seeing him on The West Wing. Harmon appeared in a 4-episode story arc as Secret Service Special Agent Simon Donovan in 2002. That performance became the turning point. Suddenly, Bellisario wasn't looking at the young Mark Harmon anymore. He was looking at an actor who had matured into exactly the kind of commanding presence Gibbs required. It was as though the character had been hiding inside Harmon all along. This is one of the most fascinating parts of the story. The actor who eventually became Gibbs did not win Bellisario over through a traditional NCIS audition in the way fans might imagine. Instead, another television series provided the evidence. Harmon's portrayal of Simon Donovan on The West Wing demonstrated a tougher, more mature side of the actor. Bellisario watched the footage, and his opinion changed almost immediately. The same man who had initially thought Harmon was too handsome for Gibbs suddenly saw the character. According to Bellisario's recollection, it didn't take long before he recognized that Harmon had developed the maturity necessary for the role. That realization was crucial because NCIS needed something very specific from Gibbs. He had to be intimidating without being theatrical. He had to be intelligent without constantly explaining how intelligent he was. He had to command loyalty without behaving like a dictator. And perhaps most importantly, he had to make silence interesting. Harmon could do that. His performance on The West Wing showed Bellisario that the actor no longer carried only the youthful image he remembered. There was weight behind him now. There was authority. There was history. There was Gibbs. Bellisario wasn't the only person who eventually saw the connection. Charles Floyd Johnson, who became one of the important producers associated with NCIS, later recalled the reaction after the team watched Harmon's West Wing performance. The consensus was remarkably simple. He was Gibbs. That is an extraordinary transformation in a casting story. One moment, Harmon was being discussed as a questionable fit. The next, the people involved in building the show were looking at him and recognizing the central character. And that tells us something important about Gibbs. The character wasn't defined by a beard, a military uniform, or a stereotypical tough guy appearance. He was defined by presence. Harmon possessed that presence. Another reason this story is so fascinating is that Mark Harmon was hardly the only name considered. The producers reportedly discussed an enormous range of actors for Gibbs. Among the names associated with the early casting process were Harrison Ford, Scott Glenn, Kevin Bacon, Chris Cooper, Alec Baldwin, Val Kilmer, Clive Owen, Tom Berenger, Charlie Sheen, Aidan Quinn, and Patrick Swayze. Some of those names were serious possibilities. Others appear to have been more speculative. Harrison Ford, for example, was reportedly considered because he seemed almost tailor-made for the role. But according to producer Charles Floyd Johnson, Ford's name never progressed much beyond discussion. Scott Glenn appears to have been more seriously considered. Andrew McCarthy was also reportedly in the mix and met with Bellisario about the role. This makes the eventual casting of Harmon even more remarkable. The producers had a long list of experienced actors. Yet the actor who had initially seemed wrong became the man who defined the character. One person deserves special credit for helping make the Harmon-Gibbs connection happen. Casting director Susan Bluestein. Bluestein had worked with Harmon previously and reportedly believed from the beginning that he possessed the gravitas necessary for Gibbs. While Bellisario wasn't convinced, Bluestein pushed for another look. That persistence mattered. Casting directors often have to recognize possibilities before creators or executives do. They understand an actor's range. They know what an actor looks like when stripped of the expectations surrounding previous roles. In Harmon's case, Bluestein apparently saw beyond the handsome leading man image. Bellisario needed to see it for himself. Once he did, the entire equation changed. The casting process eventually brought Harmon and Bellisario together. According to accounts from people involved with the show's creation, the meeting went extremely well. The chemistry between the actor and creator helped convince the production that Harmon was the right choice. And there was something else Harmon brought to the table. He wasn't interested in turning Gibbs into a superhero. That would have been easy to do. A former Marine investigator leading a team of highly trained agents could have become a conventional action hero. But Harmon approached Gibbs differently. He understood that the character's power came from restraint. Gibbs didn't need to shout to dominate a scene. He didn't need elaborate speeches. He didn't need to demonstrate his intelligence every 5 minutes. Sometimes he simply looked at someone, and the room understood. That became one of the defining qualities of NCIS. Ironically, Harmon almost walked away from another aspect of the character before the show even began. The name Leroy Jethro Gibbs was unusual. Extremely unusual. Harmon has recalled that when he first read the script, the character's name caught his attention. He liked it. Then the name was briefly changed. Bellisario apparently considered replacing Leroy Jethro Gibbs with something far more ordinary. Harmon has remembered it as something like Bob Johnson. Harmon didn't like that at all. He reportedly pushed back and insisted that the character should remain Leroy Jethro Gibbs. It is a funny detail, but it reveals something important. Harmon understood that the unusual name was part of the character's identity. Bob Johnson could have been anybody. Leroy Jethro Gibbs sounded like someone who had a story, and NCIS would eventually build an enormous mythology around that name. Another interesting twist is that Harmon himself wasn't necessarily thinking about becoming the face of a television franchise. In an interview later reflected on by H&I, Harmon explained that he didn't initially expect to like the NCIS script as much as he did. At the time, he was also thinking about spending more time at home with his young family. That makes the casting story even more extraordinary. Bellisario wasn't sure Harmon was right. Harmon wasn't sure he wanted the show. And yet the two decisions eventually aligned. The actor accepted the role. Bellisario found his Gibbs. And television history changed. The most important question isn't simply why Bellisario initially rejected Harmon. It is why Harmon ultimately proved to be such a perfect choice. The answer lies in contradiction. Gibbs was tough but compassionate, quiet but observant, emotionally guarded but deeply loyal, capable of violence but protective of innocent people. He could be intimidating in one scene and unexpectedly gentle in another. Harmon had the ability to communicate those contradictions without overplaying them. That was essential. Imagine Gibbs played by an actor who constantly emphasized how tough he was. The character might have become exhausting. Imagine Gibbs played as a traditional action hero. He might have become predictable. Instead, Harmon allowed the character's strength to emerge naturally. Gibbs rarely needed to prove anything. That made audiences believe him. Even Harmon's physical appearance changed as he settled into Gibbs. Bellisario later praised Harmon for embracing the character's distinctive Marine-style haircut, with the sides and back cut extremely short. That detail might sound superficial, but television characters are often built from dozens of small choices. The haircut, the clothing, the posture, the walk, the silence, the stare, the way Gibbs drank coffee, the way he slapped the back of a colleague's head, the way he stood behind his desk, the way he looked at a suspect before asking a devastatingly simple question. Together, those choices transformed Mark Harmon into Leroy Jethro Gibbs. The pretty boy image Bellisario had remembered gradually disappeared. In its place was the face of a Marine investigator. There is something almost poetic about Bellisario's initial hesitation. He feared Harmon looked too good for Gibbs. But Gibbs eventually became one of television's most rugged leading characters, the very quality that seemed like a disadvantage. Harmon's famous appearance became part of the character's appeal. Gibbs was not a stereotypical bruiser. He could look polished. He could appear calm. He could walk into an expensive restaurant in a suit and still make everyone believe he was the most dangerous person in the room. Harmon's understated physicality helped create that. He didn't need to look like a professional fighter. He looked like someone who had already been one. There is a difference. This is where Harmon and the character became particularly compatible. Harmon has often described Gibbs as a complicated man rather than a superhero. In a TV Insider interview, Harmon discussed his preference for exploring Gibbs's emotional scars and hidden complexity rather than playing him as a flawless hero. That philosophy helped keep the character interesting for years. Gibbs could solve a case, but solving the case wasn't always the most important thing. The audience wanted to know what was happening inside Gibbs. Why did he react that way? Why did he distrust that person? Why did he suddenly become protective? Why did he refuse to talk about his past? Why did certain memories remain buried? Why did he push people away when he clearly cared about them? Harmon could make those questions compelling without providing immediate answers. Perhaps the greatest evidence that Bellisario made the right decision is how little Gibbs sometimes needed to say. Many television protagonists depend on dialogue. Gibbs often didn't. A raised eyebrow could replace a paragraph. A long pause could replace an explanation. A glance toward Donoso could communicate annoyance, affection, and disappointment simultaneously. That economy became one of the character's trademarks. And it was particularly effective because Harmon never seemed desperate to dominate the scene. He trusted the camera. He trusted the character. He trusted silence. That quality helped distinguish Gibbs from countless other television detectives. Of course, NCIS wasn't successful because of Gibbs alone. The show's chemistry depended on the ensemble. Anthony Donoso, Abby Ciuto, Timothy McGee, Caitlin Todd, Ziva David, Ducky Mallard, and the many characters who came later gave the series its distinctive personality. But Gibbs was the anchor. The team could be chaotic because Gibbs was steady. Donoso could joke because Gibbs could silence him with one look. Abby could be eccentric because Gibbs understood her. McGee could grow because Gibbs could mentor him. Ziva could challenge authority because Gibbs knew when to push back and when to listen. The casting of Harmon therefore influenced the entire ensemble. Once Gibbs had a believable center, everyone else had something to react against. Today, it is easy to look backward and assume Harmon was obviously destined to play Gibbs. That's the danger of hindsight. Once an actor becomes inseparable from a character, it becomes almost impossible to imagine the role being played differently. But the early casting process shows that nothing was inevitable. Harmon wasn't the automatic choice. He wasn't the creator's first instinct. Other actors were considered. Some were reportedly serious contenders. And the person who eventually became Gibbs had initially been dismissed because Bellisario remembered him differently. The NCIS casting story is therefore a reminder that successful television casting often depends on seeing an actor at exactly the right moment in their career. Had Bellisario watched Harmon years earlier, perhaps his decision would have remained the same. But he saw Harmon after The West Wing. That timing mattered. Bellisario later expressed tremendous appreciation for Harmon. The creator who once thought the actor was too handsome eventually recognized that Harmon had matured into precisely the right leading man for the show. That transformation wasn't simply about age. It was about presence. Harmon had accumulated enough experience to make Gibbs believable. He could suggest decades of life without explaining them, and that's exactly what the character needed. Gibbs was supposed to feel like a man whose history existed before the first episode. Harmon could make the audience believe that history. There is another chapter to the story that makes the early casting decision even more interesting. Bellisario eventually stepped away from NCIS after the show's early years. According to Charles Floyd Johnson's later recollections, Harmon had become frustrated with the difficult working process, particularly the way scripts and storylines were being handled. Johnson emphasized that Harmon did not simply demand Bellisario's removal, but the relationship between the two men had become strained. Bellisario, meanwhile, described his departure as his own decision and said he felt it was simply time to move on. Whatever the behind-the-scenes tensions, there is an undeniable irony here. The creator initially doubted Harmon. Then, Harmon became the central figure of the franchise, and eventually, Harmon's influence became one of the forces shaping how the series operated. The actor Bellisario initially wasn't sure about became one of the people most responsible for making the show sustainable. It is important not to turn the story into a simple, creator was wrong narrative. Bellisario's instincts were actually part of what made the eventual casting successful. He had a clear idea of Gibbs. He didn't simply accept the first famous actor suggested to him. He challenged the choice. He reconsidered it. He watched Harmon's work. And then he changed his mind. That is not bad casting judgment. It is good creative judgment evolving in response to new information. Bellisario recognized that the actor he remembered was no longer the actor standing in front of him. That realization produced one of television's greatest casting decisions. For 19 seasons, Harmon carried NCIS through cast changes, evolving storylines and shifting television trends. He became the recognizable face of the franchise. Even after leaving the main series in 2022, his connection to Gibbs remained enormous. The franchise has continued exploring Gibbs's history through NCIS Origins, where Austin Stowell plays a younger version of the character and Harmon serves as an important connection to the older Gibbs. That development is perhaps the ultimate proof of how successfully Harmon established the character. A prequel can recast the younger version, but it still needs the original Gibbs to connect the story to the franchise's history. Harmon's voice, presence, and legacy remain part of the character. So why didn't Don Bellisario initially want Mark Harmon as Gibbs? The answer is surprisingly simple. He didn't think the Mark Harmon he remembered matched the Gibbs he had created. Bellisario saw Harmon as too handsome and too youthful for the grizzled, authoritative Marine investigator he envisioned. Then he watched Harmon play Simon Donovan on The West Wing. And everything changed. He saw maturity. He saw authority. He saw restraint. He saw an actor who could carry emotional history without constantly explaining it. He saw Gibbs. And that moment is one of the most fascinating what-if stories in modern television. Because if Bellisario had never reconsidered Harmon, NCIS might still have become successful. Someone else could have played Gibbs. The series might have had a completely different tone. Perhaps another actor would have made the character more openly aggressive. Perhaps Gibbs would have been more talkative. Perhaps the team chemistry would have changed. Perhaps the franchise would have looked nothing like the NCIS fans eventually came to know. But history took another path. Bellisario watched Harmon again. Harmon got the role. And the actor once dismissed as too much of a pretty boy became the definitive face of a character famous for his toughness, silence, and military authority. The greatest casting stories aren't always about actors who were obvious choices from the beginning. Sometimes they're about the choices that almost didn't happen. Mark Harmon as Gibbs is one of those stories. The actor was not originally what Bellisario imagined. He wasn't the obvious match. He wasn't the first name that made the creator immediately think, "That's Gibbs." Instead, he needed to be reconsidered. And fortunately for television history, he was. The West Wing performance gave Bellisario a different view of Harmon. The casting director pushed for another look. Harmon and Bellisario connected. The rest became television history. Today, the idea of anyone else being Gibbs feels almost impossible. That is the strange magic of casting. An actor takes a fictional character and gradually makes the character inseparable from his own identity. For Mark Harmon, that character was Leroy Jethro Gibbs. And for NCIS, Gibbs wasn't simply the boss, he was the heartbeat. The most remarkable part is that the heartbeat almost belonged to somebody else. The creator who built Gibbs initially looked at Mark Harmon and saw the wrong man. Then he watched him again, and in a matter of minutes, the wrong man became the only man he could see. Those 3 words ultimately became one of the most consequential casting realizations in television history. Because sometimes the perfect actor isn't the actor you first imagine. Sometimes you have to look again. And in the case of NCIS, that second look changed everything.